Qualitative evaluation. So thus far, much of our examination of evaluation has really focused on quantitative measures, things like surveys and just data that the institution collects. And the reason that we've looked at this so in depth is because this is really where the history of assessment has been. Also, stakeholders often want what I call as numerical sound bites. That is, they want to see quantitative data so that they can, in a sense, quantify the growth of students or the increase in retention, the increase in outcomes associated with a program or a particular intervention. And then they like these little sound bites because they can interject them when they're talking to their stakeholders in meaningful ways. So for instance, if your program increases retention from 50 to 65%, that's something that people like to state. And it's a nice quick soundbite and something that really stays in people's minds. Also, evaluation of outcomes of programs or interventions are generally in terms of outcomes. So now we're going to move forward to qualitative evaluation. So when is qualitative evaluation best? I like to conceptualize qualitative evaluation as being best when you're asking the how and the why questions in evaluation. So how participants are experiencing a program or intervention, what are participants gaining from the program or intervention, how they expect to use what they've gained in the intervention or program in the future. Really, what we're talking about is a perspective of program improvement, especially when you're talking about a holistic perspective. And that's because quotes can be very powerful tools in convincing stakeholders about the changes that need to be made in a particular program to improve it, and also to improve those outcomes. So although numerical data can be powerful in its own sense, right? If you have students who talk about their experiences, particularly students are talking about how they have successfully negotiated a program or an intervention, or let's say it's a career services type of evaluation, and the students speak about how the services have really helped them gain perspective on the job market and the kinds of things that they have to do to be successful in obtaining a job. Those can be very powerful quotes to use when you're talking about certain stakeholders. You do not want to use qualitative evaluation when the focus of the evaluation is on outcomes. That is, how many more students have graduated or how many more students are retained. Those are not really the kinds of questions that you can answer with qualitative evaluation. The other thing I'll say is when you have an incongruence between what participants expect and what, let's say, program or intervention funders expect, or what their objectives of a program are, or when the program goals are vague, that's also an opportunity to use qualitative evaluation because you can configure your findings to different constituencies. The advantages of qualitative evaluation are that, certainly one is that it brings hard numbers to life. As I said before, giving some numbers, and in an ideal situation when you're doing program evaluation, you have that quantitative piece, and then you do some form of qualitative evaluation that enables you to bring some of those numbers to life. So for instance, if you have some quantitative data that says that this program improved retention by 15%, and then you have some sound bites that speak to how exactly the program worked from the participants' own voices, that is an ideal scenario for using qualitative evaluation. As I've said before, when you want to gain insight into ways to improve a program or gain insight into what's working well in a program, these are also excellent avenues for qualitative evaluation because, as you'll see in the next few slides, you can actually hear directly from the horse's mouth what's working or what's not working. I want to take a moment and talk about sampling because it's so critical when we're talking about qualitative evaluation. In qualitative research and in qualitative evaluation, remember we had this discussion about sampling, and we don't know where from the normal distribution our sample is coming from, right? And certainly that's even more true in qualitative research, where we're talking about very small numbers of participants that we're using for data. So in this case, it becomes even more critical that you understand who is your typical participant or who is your typical non-participant, and try to craft a sample that includes all of those voices. And of course, who you include in your sample is always very dependent on the focus of your evaluation. So if you're looking to have an understanding of what's working well in a particular program, then you obviously want to talk to people who have successfully completed that program or who are currently doing very well in that program. If you're looking for ways to improve the program, then you're going to want people who are using the program, but you also are going to want to get some voices and opinions from non-participants, because part of program improvement includes outreach to a greater number of participants, right, or a greater number of students. You can envision a situation where you have students who are not using a particular service, and you want to increase those numbers of students using that service. Well, then you absolutely, qualitative evaluation is a great way to gain insight from non-participants about why they're not using the service. What are some of the issues why they're not using it? So I don't want to spend too much time talking about methods. It's no different than your typical qualitative research. There's non-participant observers, and this is someone who is an observer who's present but serves no official role in the administration of the program or intervention. I will state that I think there's one possible exception to this, and I suppose this could cross over between non-participant observers and participant observers or observation, and that's when you have a situation like Katina's, where Katina oversees advising. She could feasibly be considered a non-participant observer because she's so high on the food chain that she doesn't deal with the day-to-day interactions of some of those advisors. So if she had, let's say, an intervention to get more freshman students to do their advising earlier in the semester, right? And she's kind of overseeing all these individuals, then it's very feasible that she could be somewhat considered a non-participant observer and observe what's going on and be a part of that data collection, because she's not involved in the day-to-day issues of that intervention. There's also participant observation, and that's when the participant observer has a legitimate role in the program or intervention. Obviously, there are some validity issues associated with this. In particular, when you are the giver of services and also the collector of information, one could argue that there are validity issues there. So that is certainly problematic. I will say that one interesting way for doing participant observation is called pseudo-participants. So a lot of customer service organizations do this. They, for instance, like Macy's, will have people on staff who are, quote unquote, professional spies or professional shoppers, right? And they are trained, they are hired by Macy's or whatever the store is, and they go into the store under the guise of being a customer. And then they collect data. So technically they are, participant observers because they have a legitimate role in the program or in that intervention, but they are faking a role as a consumer. And so it is feasible that you could do this in higher education. It's a little trickier, right? But you could have, perhaps a peer from another institution pretend to come in and serve as a participant or a pseudo-participant observer. There's also the tried and true, interviewing individuals and conducting focus groups. And I can't stress how valuable some of these can be in obtaining information, particularly if what you're doing is maybe not hardcore evaluation, but maybe just like a sanity check on how things are going, or if you want to do some sort of informal evaluation. I will tell you that one of the institutions that I worked at, I coordinated bringing faculty from overseas, through this like global scholars program to teach at this elite institution for one semester. And it was a really nice gig. I mean, they got paid handsomely. They were given an apartment in New York. It was really quite nice. And so as you can imagine, there was no shortage of individuals who were willing to come to New York for a semester and teach at this elite institution, especially given that they were paid in US dollars very handsomely and given an apartment for free and all sorts of other amenities. But we had to always do a check to see if they were effective in their teaching. And the way we did this was we would invite a few students to come in and into small focus groups, and we would do, maybe 2 or 3 focus groups per instructor at the end of the semester. And these were real quick. They would come in, we would say, how's it going? Tell me about the professor, what's good, what's not good. 10 minutes. The individuals were in and out in 10 minutes. But I have to say that they were remarkably useful in determining whether we would invite a scholar back for another semester based on what the students told us, with the added benefit that the students actually felt like we cared because we were seeking their input. So certainly their satisfaction of the program and our offerings increased because they felt that they were stakeholders who were being heard in the process. So don't underestimate the value of, bringing a few students in and saying, let's just talk informally about, what's going well, what's not going well, and just having this very informal conversation or a formal conversation. Of course, whenever you're doing individual interviews or focus groups, there are the typical qualitative research suggestions apply. So, you want to develop rapport so that there is some semblance of trust, which will enhance honesty and forthcomingness. You don't want to ask compound or yes or no questions. You want to make sure you watch your nonverbal cues, and certainly your facial expressions in particular. And you want to follow up, regularly by saying, tell me more about that, or let me see if I understand you, and encapsulating what the participant or participants has told you. The one big issue with qualitative evaluation of this nature is whether you record it or not. Obviously, when individuals are very leery of getting recorded, they're concerned about how that data might be used, so they often don't like to be recorded. But there's real value in getting precise quotes and making sure that you are imposing upon this, or you are generating data that's very valid.